Well, a lot of attention, of course, has been on Ukraine over the past year after the Russian invasion. It was initially thought Russia might rout Ukraine in a number of days. That has proved to be completely the opposite. It has been a very determined Ukraine fighting back against Russia, so much so there's been embarrassment within Russia and even calls, in particular from some of their more colourful analysts and chat shows, to perhaps go nuclear. Is that a possibility? How would it actually play out as well? Joining me live is Dr. Matthew Sussex, a fellow of ANU's Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. Thanks very much for your time. I found this really interesting the other day, delving into how the process would work. And I'm not seeking to be alarmist here, but we've all known for years about the nuclear briefcase carried around by the aides of the US president. In terms of what happens in Russia, what do we know about this? Because yes, there's a nuclear briefcase that Vladimir Putin has within reach, but it's not just his power, it's more shared around.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, in the United States, it's very centralised. You know, the US president gives the order to use nuclear weapons and opens the suitcase and then it happens, pretty much automated. In the Russian system, it's much more decentralised in that if Putin decides he wants to use nuclear weapons, he can say that he wants to. That has to be then verified by the defense minister, currently Sergei Shoigu. But more than that, the Russian nuclear weapons, to get their strategic rocket forces or tactical nuclear weapons used, needs a kind of authorization code from the chief of the army, which at the moment is a guy called Valery Gerasimov. Both of them fairly close to Putin, but much more decentralized than we see in the United States system. And on the one hand, potentially a good thing in that you have many hands that get to make that decision, or many minds that get to make that decision. But on the other hand, also, the potential for groupthink to set in.
And so when you talk about that check on power, they are close to Putin, as you alluded to, but they're quite senior figures. The real question is, we think of Vladimir Putin as this all-powerful dictator. Do you think if he was sort of making a rash decision or a bit of had a bit of a hot moment and wanted to fire off one of these so-called tactical smaller nuclear weapons, and one of the generals said, no, that's not a good idea, that would be the end of it? Or would Putin sort of ride roughshod over them?
Yeah, look, I mean, knowing anything about Vladimir Putin, you'd probably expect him to have the person who says no to him immediately removed, possibly through a window, and then appoint someone who'll say yes. I mean, it is a check and balance to an extent, but it's not necessarily one that's foolproof. And in fact, it's fairly old. The Soviet Union came up with this system quite deliberately because they were worried that one of their very aging leaders would decide to give, a nuclear order, when they weren't necessarily in their right mind. There are some checks and balances, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, we could rely on Russian generals to be sober. Often military people will just simply follow orders because that's what they're conditioned to do.
Yeah. The most likely use, if it did happen, would be so-called smaller yield tactical weapons. So not, the sort of nuclear Armageddon we think of. Still a horrific situation for wherever this would be pointed, but a much smaller payload. So how would that work? What would be the likely reaction from NATO and the US to that?
Yeah, look, I mean, it depends what the Russians did with their tactical nuclear weapons. It's true that they're smaller than the big sort of strategic city-busting weapons, the ones that we always think about in sort of doomsday Armageddon scenarios. But nonetheless, they're very destructive. And, Putin's options to use nuclear weapons would probably be really only when the war was going very badly, if he was about to lose, for instance, and he wanted to turn the tide. Now, he could use a tactical nuclear weapon against Kiev to try and kill Zelensky, but that would cause an enormous amount of damage. And he could try and use them on the battlefront to try and blast holes in the Ukrainian lines, but he'd have to use a lot of them. And that means, I think, that the Western response would be one, and we'd certainly have warning and indication that this was being prepared. The Western response, I think, probably should be to communicate very clearly to Putin what the consequences would be for using nuclear weapons, and they should be severe.
Just in about 30 seconds, we've seen the Russian ability, perception versus reality on the battlefield. Could it be the same with nuclear weapons? Might they not be as, menacing as we think?
Oh, look, one of the biggest dangers when it comes to something as destructive as nuclear weapons is to assume that your adversary's nukes won't work. Russia puts a lot of money into its nuclear warheads, probably more than any other aspect of its defense forces. So I think that the most prudent thing is to assume that they'll unfortunately work just fine.